welcome to this GCSE Ready Project E, entitled Wagons Roll Migration and Settlement in the American West. This project will look at another aspect of the GCSE syllabus. You will need with you the lesson notes template that you should have been sent, and if you don't have it, you can find a link to it in the description at the bottom of this video. Okay, let's make a start. So, before we get started, we need a little bit of background, we need a little bit of context here. This is a map of the United States around about 1803. And as you can see, it looks rather different to a map of the United States now. We can see that there are some states in pink on the right-hand side, but that much of the land is either just unconquered territory like the Louisiana Purchase, Indiana Territory, or in fact is not part of the United States. The grey areas are owned by the Spanish or the British. So the story of the 19th century in American history is the story of a spreading out across the continent to create the geographical entity that is the modern United States. What is also important to note is the sheer expanse of the wilderness that was the American West in the 19th century. Here we see some fantastic cinematography in the film Dances with Wolves that gives a flavour of what the unspoilt plains of the American West looked like in the early to mid 19th century. It's important to get a sense of how forbidding a place the Great Plains were at this time. We're looking at a place of incredible magnitude. We're looking at a place with very little trees, forests, a supply of timber. We're looking at a place where there's not always a great water supply, just acres upon acres upon acres of untamed grasslands. And at the beginning of this period, Americans felt that the Great Plains was relatively uninhabitable, that the only people who could live there were Native Americans, and most people felt as though their journey west was a journey to go over the Great Plains, to somehow get beyond the Great Plains to the west coast, to Oregon in the northwest, and then eventually California in the southwest, where there was a promise of better land, great vegetation, very fertile soil. It was only in the mid to late 19th century where people started to try and settle on the Great Plains, tried to actually live there, put down roots, develop farming, and to carve out settlements on the Great Plains. And this little project is going to look at some of the reasons why people decided to move west in the early to mid 19th century, and then it's going to look at some of the problems that people encountered who tried to settle on the Great Plains in the mid to late 19th century, and also how they overcame some of these problems. Okay then, so there's a little bit of background. Now let's dig into task 1, which will be on page 2 of your lesson notes booklet. Here is a famous painting by John Gast depicting the movement of Americans west, the great move to exploration and settlement in the West. What I want you to do is to pause this in a moment and try and see if you can infer two things from this painting about American attitudes towards moving west. Remember, infer something, support it with a point of evidence, with some sort of observation from the painting, infer something else, and support that with an observation from the painting. Okay, off you go. Right, welcome back. For my mind, there are several things we can infer about American attitudes here. There's something we can infer about American attitudes to the movement west and its impact on other people. You can see in the left-hand side of the painting Native Americans who are looking pensively over their shoulders, looking worried as they are moving away from the progress of people moving from right to left, from east to west on the painting. We can see the type of people who are moving west. This tells us something about American attitudes towards settling the West. We can see farmers, we can see people who are cultivating the land. The guy in the bottom right hand corner is plowing the land. We can see steam trains that are moving from east to west. So Americans saw their movement west and their settlement west as part of a movement of progress, of technological advance, of bringing civilization in their understanding of it to the west. If you look at the central character, this angel-like character in the middle of the painting, we can infer from her presence that American attitudes was one that saw their movement west as bringing light and bringing civilization. Look what she is carrying. She has a telegraph wire in her hand as she moves west. The telegraph wire goes with her, so therefore she is bringing technological change. She is a angelic character. She is representing progress. Look at the light that shines around her and the darkness in the left hand side of the painting, the west of the painting. She is bringing light to that darkness. So there's quite a lot we can infer here about American attitudes to moving west. Remember, at first, they were not moving west to go and settle on the Great Plains, those great grassland wildernesses that you saw in the video clip. They were moving west to get beyond those plains and to move and go and find a better life, usually on the west coast in Oregon or California. And it's the reasons for that movement west, that initial migration westwards, that we are going to turn to now. Okay, in the next task, we're going to focus on reasons why people moved west. And we can usually categorize these reasons under two very simple headings: push factors, things that forced people from the east and made them go west because of the problems that existed in the east, and pull factors, that's things in the west that were encouraging people to go there, that were attracting settlers and making it appealing to move west. You will see in your lesson notes booklet that you have this table here, which has a column for push factors for moving west and pull factors for moving west. There is, after that table, some information to help you populate that table. So, in a moment, you are going to pause this. You are going to read the information that is in the booklet, and you are going to fill in the table accordingly. Off you go. All right, in the push factors column, we should be having things here like the economic depression in the East, maybe the exhaustion of farmland in the East. These are things, the problems in the East that existed that made people want to move west. In the pull factors, we have things like the California gold rush, the promise of better land. Don't underestimate the importance of the Oregon Trail as well. The Oregon Trail was important not only as a route that people could use to get to Oregon, but in itself, because it was mapped and publicized and advertised, it was a something that stimulated movement west, and it can be seen as a pull factor, the fact that it existed, the opportunity existed. We must also think about the idea of manifest destiny. This idea that Americans had a God-given right, a destiny to settle the continent. That was a big motivating factor for lots of people who felt a sense of destiny that pulled them towards the West and a new future, a brighter future in many cases, people thought. Now, one of the reasons that the Oregon Trail was important is because it gave people a land route to get to California when gold was discovered in California in the late 1840s. And this discovery of gold in California, combined with America winning the Mexican-American War in the late 1840s and suddenly annexing a huge amount of Californian territory that had previously belonged to Mexico, gives a great stimulus for people to move west and to go and try and make their fortune in the West, try and find gold in California. And it's the California gold rush that we're going to focus on in task 3. We're going to focus on the consequences of that. First of all, have a look at this.
In a couple different spots, Southern California, but not the gold fields that we associate with the gold rush. The Mexicans had no idea, of course, that gold of the amount discovered in the 1850s and 1860s actually existed there. But before California becomes a state, gold is discovered. And it's one of those transforming episodes in the American past. And the rush is on.
The gold rush is maybe the classic American story. One of the funny things about the gold rush is that very few people actually made any money from gold itself.
In Gold Rush, California, success followed a willingness to try and fail, and try and fail, and try and fail. In New England, where American culture originated, there wasn't a tolerance of failure like this. Failure was equated with sin and with moral failing. In California, the Gold Rush, none of that applied. Everybody understood that luck was as much a factor in success as anything else.
The lure of quick money has just had an enormous attraction for the new America at that time.
The scramble for mineral wealth, which is extremely ugly. It involves the rape of the countryside, the exploitation of Mexicans, the extermination of local tribes, the mistreatment of Asians who come in as laborers and are also very badly treated in the mines, the terrible loss of life and impoverishment of the people who go out and dig the stuff.
This was a signal event that transformed the landscape. It transformed the demography of California in the West, and one could argue was a seismic shift in American history of the mid-19th century.
Ironically, the great breakthrough of the gold rush was not creating fortunes from this precious metal found in the hills of California. It was, in a sense, the invention of California itself. I mean, it made this extraordinary city, San Francisco, and got enough people to move all the way out there that the state was able to really kind of turn into the extraordinary creature that it is today.
Okay, so what we're going to move on to now in task 3 is have a look at how we might answer an exam-style question on the issue of the gold rush. Here we see a question and one paragraph in response to it. Explain 2 consequences of the gold rush for migration. Okay, so you've heard some stuff there in the video about how the gold rush contributed to migration. You've also should have read towards the end of the information that you had to read about the push and pull factors. There was some information about the consequences of the gold rush. This paragraph here focuses on one particular consequence. Following the gold rush of 1849, there was increased migration westwards from the east. This was because prospectors wanted to get rich as a result of gold mining. Not only did migration increase because of prospectors, it also increased due to people migrating west to serve the prospectors by being labourers or setting up shops that the prospectors could use. By 1869, 400,000 people had moved westwards, many directly as a result of the gold rush. So what we have here is a clear explanation of consequence. One consequence of the gold rush was the sheer number of people that moved west to migrate. What you are going to do for task 3, and you can send your paragraph to your teacher when it's complete, you are going to have a go at writing the second consequence. So think about the consequence for migration. Think about the type of people who went to California and what the consequence of that was. Think about the way they got to California. What's the consequence of that for migration? So pause this now and have a go. Okay, we're going to now move on to look at the ways in which the government tried to encourage people to settle on the Great Plains and the problems that people encountered when doing that. We said right at the start of the lesson that the initial pull for people to go west, the initial motivation for them to move west, was not to settle on the plains themselves, but was to move across those great wilderness of grasslands in the Great Plains and to get themselves to Oregon or California. And you've just been doing some work about the Californian gold rush and people going across to the West Coast to try and make their fortune. Well, in 1862, the government passed something called the Homestead Act, and this was to encourage people to actually try and settle on the plains. And by this point, a lot of Native Americans had been moved from those areas of the plains into reservations. These reservations were specific areas of land where Native Americans had to live, and the idea was that more land would be freed up for white Americans to go and settle, like the people in the photograph here. And in the Homestead Act, you could pay $10 to claim 160 acres of land, and then you had to work on the land for a certain period. And if you were successful, you could then claim up, so you could pay an extra bit of money, and the land would be yours forever. So it was a very lucrative scheme. It was a very attractive scheme that encouraged people to go and settle in the West. So what we're going to look at in task 4 and for the rest of this project is some of the problems that people encountered when they went to try and settle on in the West and the plains, and how they overcame these problems. Okay, so we're going to focus, when we look at the problems of homesteading, on one particular couple, and we're going to focus on them because we have some letters and diary entries that they wrote when they were in the process of setting up their homestead in Nebraska in the 1870s. This couple are Uriah Oblinger and his wife, Mattie. You are going to read some extracts from the letters that he wrote when they were setting up their homestead in Nebraska, and you're also going to watch a little video clip with somebody reading some of those letters and some visuals to get a sense of some of the problems that homesteaders faced. You're going to read the extracts, then you're going to watch the clip which is coming, and then you're going to make a list of some of the problems that are mentioned of homesteading on the Great Plains.
This is 9 Mile Prairie, Nebraska, one of the last surviving stretches of tall grass prairie in the States, and a reminder of how the plains once looked. When Sally Hester passed through here, there was nothing but grass for hundreds of miles, no stone, no timber from which to build houses. But within 2 decades of Sally's journey, a new breed of settler was heading out west, and the Wasichu's conquest of the plains had begun. One of those who came here in the autumn of 1872 was a man called Uriah Oblinger.
Well, Ma, you must make up your mind to see a very naked-looking home at first. Nothing but the land covered with grass and a sod house to live in. But we have a soil as rich as the richest river bottoms of Indiana, and if we have health and luck, we'll have a beautiful home in a few years. All I have to do is plow up some sod, cut it in lengths, and lay up a wall and cover it, and we'll have a house. If the weather stays nice for a few days, I'll set to work, and it'll be ready when you get here.
It was always the presumption of the American people that one day they'd settle the plains. It was their manifest destiny. The plains had always been a problem, all that wasted space, infested with hostile Indians, a vast extent of wilderness dividing the settled East from the newly settled West. The first step was to forge lines of communication, and so from 1866, rail was laid at a blinding speed, up to 10 miles a day, until by 1869, they'd closed together by steel the continental nation. The railroads cut through the hunting grounds. The tracks divided the buffalo herds. The Indian backlash was bought off with federal funds. And the Plains Indians, their nomadic way of life fatally eroded, were hemmed into ever-shrinking reservations. And the way was clear for the white settlement of the plains. And they came. By railroad, in their thousands, enticed by an unprecedented offer. Head out west, stake a claim, improve the land, live there for just 5 years, and the title deeds were yours. Never before had poor whites been offered land for the taking. It was a treasure without price, but not without cost. Because to survive here, first you had to tame this landscape. And for those first pioneers like Uriah Oblinger, that meant building a home from the only material available, the grass itself. Or rather, the roots of the grass embedded in the prairie sod.
I commenced making our sod mansion last Monday, clearing the ground. Tuesday it misted rain. Wednesday I broke sod and started laying the walls. My arms are so numb and tired. Handling heavy sod is hard for me to write.
On the Oglala National Grasslands stands a reconstructed sod house built by pioneer enthusiasts.
The sod house was deteriorated to where it was more or less a square mounds of dirt. There were a few pictures, a few old-timers that knew a little bit about it, and I always had kind of an interest in pioneer history, and so I thought it would be nice to replace it or rebuild it and get some sense of the struggle our early ancestors went through. The thing that occurred to me at the time was not only was this hard, back-breaking labor, but we were paid good wages to do this work. We went home at night to a shower, we had plenty of good food, there was no real pressures. The original pioneers would have been planting as corn and beans, probably living under a tent shelter of some sort, and they were pressured to get this house done to survive the winter.
In 1886, a photographer called Solomon Butcher traveled through Custer County, Nebraska, taking pictures of those homesteaders eking out a living on this forbidding terrain. What he captures well is the indomitable spirit of the pioneer life, but also the loneliness and the brutal hardship.
I am doing just the best I know how to get along. I am not going back to Indiana to rent until I bust entirely enough to walk back. And you can just set that down and sit on it. So mind, Ma, don't come with "I can't," for it will do no good. I come to get me a home. And I want you to come determined on a home, too.
At last, Uriah's sod house was finished, and he wrote one final letter home, inviting his wife, Mattie, to join him. She pulled into the station in Saline County, Nebraska, on the 14th of May, 1873. And from that point on, it's her letters to family and friends back east that continue the story.
At home in our own house, and a sod house at that, and just ate dinner. We moved in last Wednesday, Uriah's birthday. My goods got here 2 days before I did. I got 1 teacup and a saucer broken. Pretty good luck, I think. I've got acquainted with some here. They are very sociable. And I was never in a neighborhood where all was as near on equality as they are here. Everyone's the same. We all live in sod houses or dugouts. I expect you think we live miserable because we are in a sod house, but I tell you in solid earnest, I never enjoyed myself better. It is because every lick we strike is for ourselves and not half for someone else. I tell you, this is quite a consolation to us who've been renters so long. There are no renters here.
When I think back on the homesteading and pioneering area, I can't help but appreciate how those people not only worked hard, but they had a vision. They could see that this land could be productive, and they didn't give up. And they had to be looking to the future, saying, it's going to rain, we're going to raise some crops, we're going to be successful, and someday we'll replace this with a wooden structure that will be more comfortable. I can recall my grandmother talking about having one of the first wooden homes in that area, and she felt so good about it. And now those of us that are still here are enjoying not only the fruits of the land, but the fruits of their labor. And with new technology, we have a good lifestyle in a somewhat of a harsh environment.
Okay, so you should have read the extract on task 4. If you haven't done that, do that now. You've seen the little clip there. You now need to pause and take some time to make a list of the different problems that homesteaders faced that you have been able to discover from the video clip and from the letters and diaries from Uriah Oblinger. Off you go. Okay, if we move on to task 5, which is the final task for this little project, it asks us to start to think about how some of the problems that homesteaders faced were overcome. So you should have got a sense of some of the problems that the Oblingers had involved building their sod house, some of the really harsh conditions, the fact that they had to get that house built at a certain point in the year before the winter came, otherwise they wouldn't be able to survive. The problems of the isolation, that they're building their house from scratch in the middle of nowhere. Some of the problems of planting crops, some of the problems involved in living in such harsh conditions, incredibly hot, dry summers, but also really freezing cold winters with huge snow drifts. A very, very harsh environment to live in, which is why the Native Americans who lived on the Great Plains developed a nomadic lifestyle, a nomadic way of life over many centuries, moving around following the buffalo. They did not set up farms and live off the land in the way that homesteaders were trying to do. What you're going to do in task 5 is look at how some of the problems that the Oblingers and other people had were solved over time using technology and using innovation to try and make homesteading on the plains easier. So you are going to pause this in a moment. You're going to fill in the table for task 5, which you can see in front of you, and you're going to use the information that's in the pages after task 5 to do that. Okay, so pause this and off you go. Okay, welcome back. Now, we said really right at the start of this project how forbidding this landscape was, how difficult it was going to be for people to settle on the Great Plains. And whilst the lands in California and Oregon were very fertile and people could make a living there quite easily, and we saw the impact of the gold rush on migration, actually settling on the plains was difficult, and it required better technology. It required innovations, water mills and water windmills that were developed to be able to extract water from deep inside the ground, different types of dry farming. It required new crops like turkey wheat that could be grown in harsher conditions. It required steel-tipped plows that were able to plow the very, very dense sod of the Great Plains. What also was very helpful was the invention of railway, because railway meant that you could deliver things to the plains. You could have better transportation, timber, and other equipment that was needed could be delivered to the plains, and the people on the plains would be able to send things back to the east. So, really, it was technological innovation over time that allowed people to survive in a very harsh environment, allowed people to be able to make a success of their homesteads, although many in the first wave of homesteaders in the 1860s did in fact find it difficult and had to go back to the east. Those who came later, who had the benefit of this technology, were able to succeed. Okay, that brings us to the end of this GCSE Ready Project E, focusing on the American West. If you have completed all 5 of the projects now, then you have a good sense of both some of the key topics in the GCSE syllabus, but also have had a practice at some of the key techniques that are needed to be successful. If you've done this project but you have not done any of the others, or there's some of them that you have not done, then go back in the playlist, have a look at projects A, B, C, or D, and have a go at them as well. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you have found it useful. And until next time, take care, stay safe, and